A flight attendant tore up a 12-year-old boy's boarding pass without asking a single question. What she didn't know: his father owned the entire airline. Miles Everheart had never flown solo before. At 12, the airline said he was old enough to handle it, and his dad had full faith in him. Still, his palms were damp as he clutched the paper pass, backpack snug against his shoulders. He didn't care. It held all the essentials: trail mix, his sketchbook, noise-canceling headphones, and a folded letter from his mom. "Sit by the window and look for the mountains," she had written. "It'll feel like you're flying through a painting." He must have read that sentence 20 times. Crescent Ridge wasn't home, but it was where he was headed. A 2-week robotics camp his father had helped sponsor. Miles was the only kid from his school attending, and the pride in his mother's eyes that morning still echoed in his memory. He had done everything by the book, checked in early, found his gate, waited patiently in the boarding line. The gate agent scanned people through one at a time. But when it was his turn, something changed. She stood there in a crisp navy blazer, lipstick too bold for her skin tone, and the unmistakable air of someone who thought answering questions was beneath her. Her name badge read Janice Whitaker. She glanced at him, but not at his pass. "You lost?" she asked. "No," Miles answered calmly. "I'm boarding Flight 407 to Crescent Ridge." She didn't reach for the scanner, didn't glance at her monitor. Just tilted her head and asked, "Where are your parents?" "I'm flying alone," he replied, pulling out the printed confirmation. "My dad already boarded earlier." That's when she let out one of those long, dramatic sighs that speaks volumes. "We don't just let kids stroll up here by themselves," she said, folding her arms. "I'm not strolling," Miles said, offering the ticket again. "It's right here." But instead of scanning it, she plucked the paper from his hand with 2 fingers, glanced at it for a moment, and then, without warning, ripped it in half. His jaw dropped. He couldn't even find the words. All he could do was stare at the 2 halves now hanging from her hand. "There," Janice said flatly. "Now you'll stay put while we figure out who you really are. I've seen enough fake passes to know when something feels off." The world tilted just a little. People behind him in line looked puzzled. A few exchanged glances, but no one said a word. "I didn't do anything," Miles murmured, voice trembling. "You're being disruptive now," Janice snapped. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Disruptive." That word echoed louder than her tone. He looked around. The gate, the travelers, the staff. Even the security guard slouched against the wall. But it was as if he'd become invisible. Like his presence had become a problem no one wanted to claim. Janice waved over another airline employee, a younger man wearing a headset. "Can you get TSA over here? We might have a situation." That's when the fear crept in. Not fear of flying, but fear of this. Being stuck in public, singled out, made to feel small in front of strangers, for nothing. This wasn't confusion. It was rejection. Miles slipped his hand into his jacket and grasped the note his mom had given him. He didn't read it, just held it tight, like a secret he didn't want her to see broken. And still, no one moved. But someone had noticed. Somewhere out there, someone was watching. The terminal buzzed in that in-between way, not noisy, not quiet. A suitcase thudded past. A baby wailed near a charging station. A businessman scrolled through spreadsheets 2 seats away. Life continued, like nothing had happened. Miles just stood there, holding the torn edges of his ticket, unsure whether to sit or stand. He hadn't cried, not yet, but his eyes were starting to sting. The world kept spinning like nothing was wrong. Miles Everheart stood motionless, still clutching the torn halves of his boarding pass. He didn't know if he should sit or stay upright. He hadn't cried yet, but the sting behind his eyes was building fast. Across from him, the younger flight attendant with the headset looked uneasy. His badge read Eli Chambers, and he kept shifting from one foot to the other like he wanted to speak up, but didn't. Meanwhile, Janice Whitaker stood firm, arms crossed, posture stiff with self-importance, as if she'd just thwarted a national security threat instead of humiliating a 12-year-old boy in public. Miles tried one more time. "Ma'am, if you just scan my name, my dad's already on board. His name is Grant Everheart." That name made her blink, just for a moment. A flicker of something, recognition maybe, but she buried it fast. "I don't care what name you toss around," she replied coolly. "I've been doing this job for 2 decades. I know when something smells fishy." "I didn't lie about anything," Miles said, voice low but steady. "You're getting combative now," she snapped. "Is that really the road you want to take?" He didn't answer, not because he didn't have the words, but because he didn't want to give her anything else to twist. Then the TSA officer arrived. He was stocky, maybe in his 50s, chewing gum like he had nowhere else to be, wearing mirrored sunglasses indoors. He gave Miles a quick once-over, then glanced at Janice. "What's the issue?" "Possibly a fake pass," Janice said, arms still folded. "He says he's flying alone. No ID, giving attitude." The officer raised a brow and turned to Miles. "You got a guardian here, kid?" "My dad's on the plane already," Miles replied. "Name?" "Miles Everhart." The officer pulled out a tablet, tapped in a few commands, and waited. After a few beats, he looked up. "Everhart?" "Yeah, we've got 2 on the manifest. Grant Everhart checked in about 30 minutes ago, and the minor's listed under UM service." Janice frowned. "UM. Unaccompanied minor," the officer said bluntly. "The system's clear. He's good." Janice's jaw tensed, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, arms still crossed, as if the facts themselves had insulted her. The TSA officer turned back to Miles. "You all right, son?" Miles nodded. He wasn't, not really, but he wasn't about to say that. "All good here," the officer muttered, stepping back. "Looks like someone jumped the gun, but Janice Whitaker wasn't ready to let it go. Well, he still shouldn't have come up to the gate without an escort. There are procedures and—" "No," Eli Chambers finally spoke, voice soft but sure. "He followed protocol. He checked in with me over an hour ago. I confirmed his UM status myself." Janice's gaze could have cut glass. But Eli didn't back down. Something shifted then, not in the air, but in the room, in the way people were starting to watch. A woman, probably late 30s, seated near the window, finally spoke. I saw the whole thing. He was standing there with his ticket. He didn't do anything wrong. Someone else murmured from behind, "Yeah, this doesn't feel right." The spell was cracking. Miles looked around, still holding his torn ticket, still stunned, but something had changed. He didn't want drama. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted someone, anyone, to say, "I see you." And this wasn't okay. Eli tapped the mic on his headset. "We need a supervisor at gate D14. Right away." Janice didn't say a word, just stood there, lips drawn into a hard line, gripping onto whatever authority she thought she still had. Miles stepped back a little, still quiet, still shaken. But the silence around him? It wasn't as lonely anymore. It had opened just a little. Before anyone else could speak, before things could be smoothed over or swept aside, a voice rose from behind the security barrier. It didn't shout. It didn't crack. It didn't need to. "Is there a reason my son isn't on that flight?" Every head at the gate turned. He wasn't tall in the way people expect power to be. No booming voice, no dramatic entrance. But Grant Everhart didn't need theatrics. He moved with calm precision, shoulders relaxed, chin level, gaze sharp and steady. A slate gray jacket over a crisp white shirt. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. You wouldn't guess his status from the way he dressed. But Eli knew. His eyes widened. "Mr. Everhart, sir, I thought you had already boarded." "I stayed behind to observe," Grant said simply. "We've had passenger complaints on this route. I wanted to see things firsthand." Then he looked at Miles, still clutching the shredded pass. "And it seems I saw more than I expected. And it seems," Grant Everhart continued, "I saw more than I expected." Janice Whitaker shifted her weight, suddenly aware of how exposed she was. "I didn't realize you were—" You weren't supposed to, Grant interrupted, calm, not angry, but with a tone that made it clear who was now steering the conversation. Miles took a step closer, finally letting out the breath he'd been holding since the moment his pass was torn. "Dad," he whispered. "You okay?" Grant asked. Miles gave a faint nod. She said, "I had a fake ticket," then ripped it up. Grant didn't flinch. He turned to Janice. "Did you scan his name?" Well, no. I didn't get that far." "Did you check the UM list?" "The barcode on his backpack links directly to his file. I didn't think I needed to." "You didn't think," Grant repeated, voice steady. "You assumed." Janice's cheeks flushed, but she didn't move. Eli Chambers stepped in again, voice firmer this time. "He was checked in properly. I confirmed his UM status myself. No flags in the system." Grant nodded once. Then, "Tell me, why was his ticket destroyed?" Janice's lips parted, but no words came out. "I'd like a supervisor," Grant said, still in that measured, composed tone. "And I'd like this entire incident reviewed on the gate's security feed. I want the footage from the moment my son was stopped, the full exchange, and the exact time she destroyed his boarding pass." Eli tapped his headset. "Already requesting it, sir." The woman who'd spoken up earlier, the one near the seating area, rose and walked over. "I saw everything," she said gently. "Your son was polite. He said he was flying alone. He showed his ticket." She didn't even look at it. Grant gave her a small nod. "Thank you." Janice's arms dropped from her chest. She still stood tall, but something in her had buckled. She was no longer posturing, just holding on. "I didn't know who he was," she said finally, clinging to the excuse like a lifeline. "That's the problem," Grant replied quietly. "It shouldn't matter who he is." A heavy silence settled over the gate, one that didn't demand a response. It just was. Moments later, a supervisor arrived, brisk steps, badge catching the light overhead. "Mr. Everheart, apologies for the delay," he said, scanning the situation. "We were just briefed. We'll need a formal report," Grant said. "And I want full assurance my son can board without further interference." "Yes, absolutely. He's cleared. We'll issue a new boarding pass immediately." Miles said nothing. His eyes were still locked on the scraps of paper in his hand. Grant placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You good to fly?" Miles nodded, barely audible. I don't get why she looked at me like that." Grant didn't answer right away. He looked at his son, then back at Janice. She saw what she wanted to see, not what was there. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Mr. Everheart, do you want us to handle this internally?" Grant replied without hesitation. "I'll be filing my own report. I'm not looking for drama. I'm looking for accountability." The words lingered, sharp, but not cruel. Even as apologies trickled out and a new pass was rushed to print, something deeper had rooted itself in the moment. This wasn't going to be smoothed over with a fresh boarding pass. Miles stood near the window now, away from the others, watching the tarmac. Behind him, the gate agents scrambled like ants, suddenly remembering how to look busy. Grant remained where he was, calm but grounded, refusing to let this slip by quietly. Behind the desk, Janice Whitaker sat stiffly, pretending to adjust seating charts that didn't need adjusting. She could feel the eyes on her now. Grant walked over, deliberate, not hostile, just clear. "You didn't just tear up a boarding pass," he said gently. "You tore up a moment my son had been counting down to for weeks." Janice's hand froze on the keyboard. She didn't look at him. "I made a judgment call," she said. "No," Grant replied. "You made a judgment. Full stop." She slowly turned toward him, jaw tightening. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm stating what already happened," he said evenly. "You made a decision about my son the second you saw him. Before he spoke. Before you checked his name. Before you did your job." She crossed her arms again, almost on instinct. "I was protecting the flight's integrity. We're trained to catch inconsistencies." "And what exactly was the inconsistency?" he asked. "A child with a ticket, standing in line quietly waiting his turn. Janice opened her mouth like she wanted to push back, but there was nothing left to stand on. But there was nothing left for Janice Whittaker to defend. The security footage had already been flagged. Eli Chambers had made sure of that. The supervisor stood just a few feet away listening silently, not interrupting. Grant Everheart wasn't finished. "You know what the worst part is?" he said quietly. "You didn't hesitate. Not once. Not until you realized who I was. And even then, you weren't sorry. You were scrambling." Janice's face flushed again. She glanced toward the supervisor, maybe hoping for backup, but he remained still. "I didn't build this airline because I needed to," Grant continued. "I built it because I believed flying could feel fair, inclusive. Like you belonged up there, no matter what your name was." He let the words settle, his voice never rising, but cutting deep, nonetheless. "And today you reminded me how far we still have to go." Janice looked down at the floor, saying nothing. "You thought no one would notice," Grant said, "that no one would care enough to speak up. And most of the time you're probably right." He motioned to the crowd, some of whom were still watching, but many had returned to their phones, their earbuds, their safe distractions. "That's the danger," he said, his voice steady. "The silence. Not just yours, but theirs. The kind that sees wrong and decides it's easier to pretend it didn't happen." Janice opened her mouth, just barely. Her voice cracked. "I didn't mean to." "But you did," he replied. "You made my son feel like a threat, like a situation. And there's no customer service seminar in the world that undoes that." She looked like she might say something else, but then stopped, and maybe that was better. Sometimes silence is the most honest thing left. Grant stepped back, not to give her room to recover, but to give her space to sit with it. Eli approached again quietly. "Mr. Everheart," he said, "your son's new pass is ready. We upgraded him to first class. No charge." "Thank you," Grant replied, "not for the seat. For speaking up earlier. That took guts." Eli nodded once, then turned back toward the desk. Miles returned to his father's side. His eyes were still wide, but more steady now. "Do I have to sit in the front?" he asked. "I kind of like the wing seats better." Grant smiled slightly. "We'll trade, if you want." The supervisor cleared his throat. "Mr. Everheart, I want to personally apologize. This isn't what we stand for." "I hope not," Grant said, "but I'll be watching." The supervisor nodded, eyes firm. "We'll take it from here." As Grant and Miles walked toward the jet bridge, it wasn't what had been said that lingered. It was what hadn't been. The silence. The people who'd seen and chosen comfort over courage. The jet bridge smelled like recycled air and buzzed faintly with electricity. But as father and son walked side by side, it felt heavier somehow, as if they were stepping into a different kind of pressure, one that carried consequences with it. Inside the aircraft, the flight crew had already been briefed. A woman in her late 40s stood waiting near the door, dressed in the same Navy uniform Janice Whittaker wore, but with softer eyes and a steadier presence. "Mr. Everheart," she said warmly, "we're truly sorry for what happened at the gate. Your seats are ready. And, Miles, if you'd like to visit the cockpit before takeoff, the captain would love to meet you." Miles blinked. "Really?" She smiled. "Really? He's a fan of your dad." Grant gave his son a gentle nudge on the back. "Go ahead. I'll be right here." As Miles followed the attendant down the aisle, Grant watched him go with a strange mix of pride and something heavier, something that settled behind his ribs like an old bruise. He'd gotten used to moments like this, but that didn't mean it hurt any less when it hit his family. Sliding into seat 2A, Grant pulled out his phone. No work emails, not yet. Instead, he opened the Notes app and typed, "To a Chief of Staff incident at Riverbend Terminal D7 gate agent, mishandled UM passenger security footage, flagged requesting full review and retraining initiative. I'll write the report myself. This one's personal." He hit send and leaned back in his seat. Outside the window, the airport bustle carried on. But inside that quiet cabin, Grant Everheart knew this wasn't just about today. And it wasn't over. Request internal review. Retraining evaluation. I'll handle the report myself. This one's personal. Grant Everheart hit send and leaned back in his seat, staring out the small oval window as the jet bridge pulled away from the terminal. Back inside the airport, the aftermath had already begun. Harold Lanning, the supervisor, stood quietly near the desk. Eli Chambers, now technically off-duty, lingered nearby with his arms crossed. And Janice Whitaker, still at her post, sat stiffly, eyes locked on her monitor, like the right line of code might undo what had just happened. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Harold asked her gently. She didn't look up. "Disciplinary review, at the very least." Her jaw tensed. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant," he said, his voice level but firm. "But meaning something and doing it, those are different things. And what you did, it's documented. You acted without cause. You disregarded protocol. You singled out a child." He paused. "And now we've got pressure from the top." She said nothing, but the truth of it was settling in. Eli stood beside them, not smug, not satisfied, just watching. Tired. "You could have handled it differently," he said quietly. "You had all the info. The manifest was flagged. You just didn't care." Janice finally snapped, voice sharp but low. "Don't act like you've never made a mistake." "I have," Eli replied calmly. "But I've never torn up a kid's ticket because he didn't look like someone I expected to be flying first class." "All right," Harold said, cutting in. "That's enough. HR will take it from here." Eli exhaled, then walked away without saying goodbye. Back on the plane, Miles returned from the cockpit, eyes a little brighter than before. "Dad," he said with a small grin, "they let me press one of the buttons." Grant raised an eyebrow. "Did you ask what it did first?" "I'm not trying to pop the cargo door mid-air," Miles laughed. Grant chuckled. For the first time that day, it felt real. A few minutes later, the flight attendants gave the safety demonstration. Passengers buckled in. The hum of the cabin settled. Miles turned in his seat. "Are you mad at her?" Grant paused. "No. Why not?" "Because getting mad is easy," he said. "Making sure it doesn't happen again, that's harder. That's where the real work is." Miles leaned back, quiet again. "She looked at me," he said softly, "like I didn't belong there. I know I didn't like that." "You're not supposed to," Grant replied. Miles reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the note from his mom, now worn and creased from how tightly he'd held it all day. "Still gonna look for the mountains," he mumbled. Grant looked out the window. "You'll see them. And a lot more. Just don't ever let someone like her make you question whether you deserve the seat you earned." Miles nodded slowly, but even as the plane lifted from the runway, Grant knew that conversation wasn't over, because the system that allowed this to happen wasn't stuck at the gate. It was everywhere, and it was going to take more than one flight to fix. By the time they leveled above the clouds, the city behind them had shrunk into soft blurs of light and grid lines, like the world could be packed in a suitcase and stowed in the overhead bin. Miles leaned closer to the window, pressing his forehead to the cool plastic. "I think I see snow," he whispered. "On the mountains." Grant glanced. "Could be Griffin Peak." "Looks like powdered sugar," Miles said. They both smiled just a little. The tension hadn't vanished, but here, at 30,000 feet, it finally felt like they could breathe again. The flight was just under 2 hours. Smooth skies, that quiet mix of rustling pages, earbuds clicking in, passengers retreating into their mid-air rhythms. At one point, a different flight attendant, Marissa, name stitched in soft cursive, walked over holding 2 glasses of water and a folded slip of paper. "This came from the gate supervisor before takeoff," she said in a low voice. "He asked me to make sure you got it." Grant unfolded it. "Mr. Everhart, we've launched a review of all recent gate interactions. It starts tomorrow. I know a formal apology isn't enough, but we'll do better." Harold Lanning Grant folded the note quietly and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat. Across the aisle, an older man, maybe mid-60s, silver buzz cut, denim jacket, leaned in slightly. "That your boy?" he asked. Grant turned. "Yeah." He handled himself real calm back there. Most kids would have fallen apart. "He's been taught not to," Grant said. The man nodded, then looked toward Miles. "My grandson's about his age," he said. "Kids like them, they've got to be twice as patient." Grant didn't answer right away. "Twice as patient," he echoed. "3 times as careful. And things still happen." The man gave a slow nod. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the flight. He didn't need to. The man gave a small, knowing nod and leaned back in his seat. He didn't say another word for the rest of the flight. He didn't need to. Miles stretched his legs and yawned. "Do you think they'll fire her?" "I don't know," Grant replied. "Do you want them to?" Miles thought for a moment. "No," he said. "I want them to understand, to know why it mattered." "Why?" "It always mattered. People don't learn when you just erase them," he added. "They learn when they're forced to see what they couldn't before." He glanced down at his sketch pad, finally flipping it open for the first time since boarding. Pencil in hand, he started to draw snow-dusted mountains, drifting clouds, and a long plane slicing through the sky. "You think she'll remember this?" he asked. "I think it'll follow her," Grant said. "Good." They didn't talk much after that, but the quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It felt different now, like understanding, or maybe just the calm that comes after the hardest part is over. When the plane touched down in Crescent Ridge, the cabin filled with the usual stirrings, seat belts clicking, overhead bins popping, voices stretching after hours of stillness. Near the front of the aircraft, an airport staff member stood waiting with a small placard that read, "Unaccompanied minor, Miles Everheart Protocol." As they exited, Grant rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'll see you in 2 weeks. You flying out to get me? Wouldn't miss it." Miles grinned and picked up his bag. Marissa, the flight attendant, smiled warmly at them both. "Have a great time at camp, young man." "Thanks," Miles said, then turned to his dad. "Love you. Love you too." Grant stood there for a moment, watching his son disappear into the terminal with the airport escort. The full weight of the day pressed against his chest, not in a way that crushed him, but in a way that reminded him why he had built this airline in the first place. Because for some people, flying was just travel. For others, it was a battlefield, a place where being polite didn't always protect you, where silence let things rot, and where even the sky wasn't neutral. But what Grant knew, and what he had taught Miles to believe, was this: the right thing doesn't stop being right just because it's inconvenient. 2 days later, Grant sat in his office, 22 floors above downtown Baycross. The windows behind him stretched wide across the bay, the bridge just a silver arc in the distance. Fog curled along the skyline like fingers, but Grant wasn't looking out the window. He was rereading an email. "Mr. Everheart, Janice Whitaker has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full review. As per your recommendation, we're launching a system-wide training initiative focused on bias recognition, de-escalation, and youth passenger protocol. I appreciate your restraint and your reminder that accountability is more than punishment." Sincerely, Harold Lanning Grant leaned back in his chair. There was no sense of victory, no pleasure in being right. But there was something else, a quiet steadiness, a shift. Not everything had changed, but something had. A knock at the door. His assistant peeked in. "You've got your 2:30 with legal, and a voicemail from Riverbend's gate rep. A woman stopped by asking for a meeting with you." "Name?" "Janice Whitaker." Grant sighed. "Set it for next week. 10 minutes. No longer. We'll do." She shut the door. Grant reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out what was left of Miles's boarding pass. Still torn, creased, and folded neatly in half. He hadn't kept it out of spite. He kept it because it was real, paper thin, but heavy with meaning. That evening, Grant's phone buzzed. It was a call from camp. "Dad," Miles said, breathless. "They let us build drones today." "Yeah? How'd it go?" "I flew mine straight into a tree." Grant chuckled. "Well, hey, at least it took off. I'll send you a picture once I get it out of the branches. How's everything else?" Miles paused. "Good. But guess what?" "What?" "There's this kid from Texas. He asked me what I want to be when I grow up. I told him I didn't know. And he said, 'You look like you're going to run stuff one day.'" Grant smiled. "He's not wrong," he said. Miles was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, "I didn't feel like that at the airport." "I know," Grant replied. "But one day," he added, "maybe someone will see you, and instead of making assumptions, they'll remember your name, not because of what I built, but because of who you are." Grant Everheart smiled. "He's not wrong," he said. "I didn't feel like that at the airport," Miles replied quietly. "I know," Grant said gently, "but one day, maybe someone will see you, and instead of making assumptions, they'll remember your name. Not because of what I've built, but because of who you are." Miles didn't say anything right away. Then finally, "I drew her, the gate lady." Grant blinked. "You did?" "Yeah," Miles said. "Not angry or anything, just normal. I drew her behind a desk and wrote, 'Do better' on the glass in front of her." Grant let that land. "That's a good drawing. I think I'll keep it." They said their good nights, and the call ended. Grant sat alone in his dark office for a while longer. The city outside was quiet, wrapped in fog, lights flickering like slow-breathing stars. What happened at that gate? That wasn't rare. That was the part most people didn't understand. It wasn't a shock. It was a pattern. But patterns could be broken, not with noise, but with action, with calling things what they were when it would be easier to stay silent, with raising a son who could keep his footing when the ground beneath him shifted, with knowing that not everyone has a parent in the first-class lounge ready to intervene. And that's why silence could never be the answer. Not at airports, not at school, not anywhere. So if you're reading or watching this right now and thinking, "I've seen this happen. I've been Miles. I've been quiet when I should have spoken up," you're not alone. And that's the lesson here. Silence doesn't protect. It permits. And when people finally speak, really speak, systems start to shift. If this story moved you, share it. Not for views, for awareness, for accountability, for every kid just trying to get to their seat without being treated like a problem. Subscribe if you believe respect should never depend on recognition. And the next time something doesn't feel right, don't look away. Say something.